Okay, welcome all to Critical Antiquities workshop for today. It's wonderful to have Professor Marco Formisano here, and I'll introduce him in a minute. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land here, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge the devastation wreaked by colonisation and its ongoing effects. And we commit ourselves to truth-telling, to education, to reconciliation and praxis. Marco Formisano is a difficult man to introduce, but I want to call him Mr. European because having looked at his impressive biography, it's clear that he has just this deep formation all across Europe. So Marco is Italian by birth, studied classics as an undergrad at the University of Palermo, but then also studied in Paris, in Berlin, and received his PhD back at the University of Palermo in the year 2000. From there, though, his European adventures were not over. After several stints at other European institutions, such as the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, the University of Pavia, Palermo, the Humboldt University in Berlin, the Warburg Institute in London, then across the pond to the Italian Academy of Advanced Study at Columbia University. He finally landed in Belgium. He became Professor of Latin Literature at Ghent University in 2013, and there he's also a member of the Sarton Centre of the History of Science and the principal investigator of a project which went from 2015 to 2019, Epitome in Late Latin Literature. He has broad and very interesting research interests. He specializes in the literature and poetics of late antiquity, but also in ancient literature of knowledge, acts and passions of the early Christian martyrs, Latin panegyrics, and this is my favorite, masochism in ancient and modern literature. And I have a student at Wollongong who's busting to talk to you about that. And I think I only talk about it, not inflict it. So he has many publications, and I can't go through all of them, but especially because so many of them are in Italian, and I feel like it could take us a while to read out the Italian and translate them. But he has many incredible how many edited books you've managed to pull together in the last 10 or 15 years, Marco, in addition to your monograph and editions of ancient texts, such as Biblia Perpetua's Passio Perpetuae Felicitatis, with an introduction, a Latin text, an Italian translation and commentary published in 2015, the Gezios Arte della Guerra Romana in 2010. There's an impressive list of publications to name, and it's just a great delight to have him here. And I'm very excited to hear him talk on the nomadic alternative, classics in motion. So please join me. Did you unmute yourself?
I was unmuting myself,
yeah.
But there is this.
So you don't have to because the room is picking up.
So I don't need to.
Correct. Yeah.
Andre was saying that the sound is not good though.
Oh, okay.
Are you still having difficulties with the sound, Andre?
It seems to be a bit better now.
Okay, good.
I can speak like that. I don't need to. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now is okay.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre.
Yeah, so let me begin by thanking you, Ben and Tristan, for inviting me to this very interesting and engaging series of talks. I've been able, of course, to follow a little bit online, and this is my first time in Australia, so I'm very excited. I love it here, and I just wanted to tell you that I'm not in perfect form. I'm completely jet-lagged, I was saying. So excuse me if I'm not, I'm not entirely myself, which is also part, after all, of my very disturbing paper. Okay, so let me share the screen, perhaps. Yeah. I prepared a PowerPoint with my texts. Okay, so I'd like to begin my presentation with a warning. What follows is intended to be a mix of various thoughts stemming from my own biography and perception of the profession that I happen to practice, as well as my research interest, or perhaps more pompously, my intellectual ambitions. This paper is a sort of patchwork of various texts that I have already discussed in various circumstances. I have brought these texts together for this presentation because I realized that what I have written in the last 15 years or so is actually responding to the same impulse, to escape the center, the canon and its logic that characterizes the field of the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature. This lecture will therefore consist of a series of rather impressionistic segments. Those of you who are expecting a neat argument with a clear beginning and a resolution at the end will be disappointed. I have no excuses to offer since I'm proceeding in this way consciously. In the past, I've tried to make sense of my approach using categories such as foreigner, immigrant, or émigré, but I couldn't really cope with them because all the examples I might have cited shared a characteristic. A foreigner or an émigré goes through a process that, no matter how dramatic, existentially intense and painful it has been, leads at the end to a more or less stable situation. They move to a different place where they may struggle, but no matter how dramatically that struggle has shaped their life, in the end they settle down, learn the language, become more or less well integrated, and sometimes become powerful intellectual actors precisely in virtue of their experience. Examples include Edward Said, Rosy Braidotti, Salman Rushdie, and many others. In fact, that their books exist is the manifestation of what this process has resulted in. Nomads are different. For, as argued by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in their treatise on nomadology contained in 1000 Platon, that largely inspires my discussion. A nomad, unlike, for instance, an immigrant who moves from point to another in order to settle down, follows a trajectory. And the trajectory is not a road. Rather, a trajectory runs between different points, not from one point to another. The point of the trajectory are not meant to become fixed places, since a nomad never stays, always goes. So I would like to show you a very primitive kind of short video, and then I will explain what this is really about. We need the sound. Okay, so here I show you one of my favorite places in Berlin. The Tempelhofer Feld is an enormous green surface used as a park. It is the site of the Tempelhof Airport that was closed in the early 2000s, including its former runways. This park always impressed me. When I go for a run, I don't know where precisely this will happen. I don't have a route in mind. There are paths only outside of this large space. So if you run in this green space or meadow, you might feel lost while being located on a huge green surface that doesn't give you any guidance. Also, what makes the perception of these spaces so fascinating to me is that its weird configuration can be perceived only if one moves very rapidly and randomly. Deleuze and Guattari again distinguish between an extensive movement and an intensive speed. Movement requires that one starts from one point and arrives at another, and this can happen only if the space is striated. i.e. a space with roads, clear borders, and edges, whereas speed per se doesn't need a divided, i.e. a striated space. For speed is an indivisible intensity and requires a smooth space. Smooth being pure spatiality without any sign of human control and division. Please keep this image in mind during my discussions, since it really starts from there. Also keep in mind what Deleuze and Guattari say about the kind of knowledge produced by nomads. It is messy, uncertain. Nomad science, as they call it, is a space of constant transformation, and above all, is problematic rather than theorematic. As you now know, thanks to the kind introduction of Ben and Tristan, I was born in Italy, studied there, and also in Paris. And I have been in a variety of different places for shorter and longer stays. Germany, UK, USA, and Brazil. A lot of Brazil in my life right now. Since 2013, I have been teaching Latin literature at Ghent University in Flanders, Belgium. In addition to Italian, I speak English, German, Dutch, French, and Portuguese. With each one of these languages, I have a unique relationship since I speak them in different contexts and situations. I lecture in all of them, and all of these languages are in various ways present in my everyday communications. As you might hear, I have a rather strong accent. Also, and it is not false modesty, I don't feel like an accomplished and competent speaker in any of these languages. I do speak them all, but I cannot say that I master them. In fact, the opposite is true. For example, Dutch is the language in which I teach at my university, but paradoxically, I think I can say that I barely speak Dutch, i.e. in everyday contexts. All this is certainly not to say that I feel special in any regard. I simply feel always in between. There are things that I can think and say only in one of these languages without interference from another language. At the same time, more importantly for my argument, I don't feel home in any of them. I frequently struggle to find the right word or nuance, so that I find myself constantly aware of my own inadequacy and inappropriateness, even in Italian. Rosi Bredotti, in her nomadic subjects, referring to herself as a polyglot, a definition that I resist for myself for different reasons, states, settling in between languages came my new contingent home. For my part, I'd say that the very concept of home is very much forged by my multilingual daily experience. As a term home, Heimat in German, is problematized by the fact that I'm never home. Even the place where I was born and grew up is not my home anymore. One of the most banal questions that people ask, where do you live, requires, in my case, a number of qualifications. I live, and I would say I have homes at least in 3 different cities, in 3 different countries. And rarely I do stay in the same place for longer than a week. Again, Bredotti, the polyglot surveys this situation with the greatest critical distance. A person who is in transit between the languages, neither here nor there, is capable of some healthy skepticism about steady identities and mother tongues. Bredotti, on these points, refers to Trinh Minh Ha, a Vietnamese thinker and filmmaker, who affirms that multiculturalism doesn't get us very far if it is understood only as a difference between cultures. Rather, we need to think of it as a difference within the same culture, namely within every self. I could speak for hours about the relationship of a nomad with language and languages in dialogue with Rosi Bredotti, but now I must move on to illustrate how the circumstances of my own biography, which to be sure I do not consider unique or a mark of glory, influence the way I approach ancient textualities. In what follows, I don't want to further elaborate on nomadic theory like Deleuze and Guattari and Bredotti, among others. Rather, more modestly, I'd like to sketch or hint to hermeneutic possibilities and ways of reading ancient texts that may have been neglected or obscured because interpreters were not interested or even inclined to recognize those possibilities, probably because of their sedentary way of life and way of thinking. Nota bene, neither Deleuze nor Guattari nor Bredotti, to judge by what they write in their works, felt or feel like nomads themselves. So you can think along the lines of nomadism without embracing a nomadic existence. So just to be clear about this point, although I'm putting prominence on my own experience as an interpreter, this does not by any means imply that I'm arguing for an identification between life and profession. And I will be discussing this point this afternoon in the talk at Wollongong on the example of the Ovidian Arachne, but this is another story. In this sense, and Tom knows already that later. In this sense, I take inspiration from the British writer Bruce Chatwin's unaccomplished work that he named The Nomadic Alternative. I have proposed one title, The Nomadic Alternative. We obviously won't use it. It is too rational a title for a subject that appeals to irrational instincts. We only have fragments and sketches, mostly contained in Chatwin's private correspondence, collected in a posthumously published book bearing the title Under the Sun. Nomadism, truth to tell, is the hallmark of Chatwin's production. Think of the marvelous song lines narrating a journey through Australia. Chatwin insisted on the fact that humans are inherently nomadic subjects, no matter how much they have settled down. In other words, nomadism represented for him the most relevant characteristic of human existence, and all in his work he basically treated the same subject. And yet, as Chatwin writes, nomads are uncivilized, and all the words traditionally used in connection with them are charged with civilized prejudices. Vagrant, vagabond, shifty, barbarian, savage, etc. Wandering nomads are bound to be a disruptive influence, but they have been blamed out of all proportion to the material damage they cause. The blame is rationalized and justified by false piety. The nomads are excluded, they are outcasts. Cain wandered over the surface of the earth, where surface is the key term to me. Nomadism has been banned from the life of the civilized, and a nomadic approach barely exists. As Bredotti points out, describing her own theoretical enterprise, the central concern for my nomadic subject is that there is a noticeable gap between how we live and how we represent to ourselves this lived existence in theoretical terms and discourses. The systems of theoretical representation we have inherited from critical theory in the past are simply inadequate to the task. This imaginative poverty can be read as the jet lag problem of being behind one's time, or inhabiting simultaneously different time zones in the schizophrenic mode that is characteristic of the historical era of postmodernity. But how can we, bypassing the theoretical jet lag described by Bredotti, make the nomadic alternative a productive critical category that is good for the interpretation of ancient literature? My project implies that through the nomadic gaze, not only might we be able to identify new topics within text, but also, and more importantly, we might on the one hand disrupt the usual hegemonic hermeneutic categories implicitly sustained by sedentarism, such as, for instance, canonicity, attachment to the immediate historical and personal context, obsessions with origins and genealogy, translated in a pervicacious, self-sustained use of intertextuality, among others. On the other hand, we might be unable to radically change our way of reading those texts, since we would be more inclined to finding the suspension, the in-betweenness, so to speak, the not resolved. And this unresolvedness would help us to consider with different eyes our relationships within Western culture to its classical antiquity, in particular to its textuality. My nomadic alternative could therefore become a hermeneutic alternative within the current debates about the status of ancient Greek and Latin studies. Given the time constraints, today I can only give some examples, by no means systematically or exhaustively, in order to give a sense of what my discussion might offer. In what follows, I identify only one aspect or theme that a nomadic alternative can test. This is the essence of an edge, boundary, border, or limit. Ab oris, a discourse on the edge. Let's start from the ab ovo of Latin literature. Arma virumque canon troietque primus ab oris. Italiam fato profugos da linea quavenit, litora multum multille terris iactatus et auto. It is well known that the whole critical tradition focused mainly on the first three words of Virgil's Aeneid. The weapons, the man, and of course, the song. Of course. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, of course, an epic discourse, of course. All true, I don't want to deny this. And yet, ab oris wonderfully closes the first line, although it logically represents the beginning of Aeneas' story, and yet it is located at the end of the line. An ora is a border, an edge, and hence the limits what in fact cannot be delimited, the beginning of Aeneas' enterprise and of Virgil's epic. Only after 5 words composing the second line, line 3 begins with the other logical edge, the Lavinia litora, that actually represents the end of Aeneas' Odyssean journey. And yet, those litora open the line. There is a sort of suspension between the two poles of this mini narrative. The entire journey of the titular hero takes place literally in between. May I suggest that ab oris is not only important as Arma virumque, but that it actually resonates more powerfully with our own time's preoccupations. Arma virumque, weapons and man, really. Let's continue indulging in exploring this avenue without taking too much account of Eugenian scholarship. Litora, orae, borders and edges constantly accompany the narrative, especially in crucial moments. In the flux of the tale, Book 6 and 7 are particularly interesting since they mark an internal edge. In intertextual terms, the passage of Aeneas' Odyssey to his Iliad. Book 6 ends with an insistence on edges. Aeneas, accompanied by his father, you say Anchises or Anchises? Anchises. And the Sibyl leaves Elysium through the Ivory Gate and joins his companions. Tum se caiete recto limite portum, ancora de prora iacitur stant liture pupes. Then he made for the harbor of Gaeta by a straight course. Anchors were cast from the bows. The ships stand along the shore. This evidently is a moment of stalemate. Aeneas conducts the boats along the shore in order to park them. Noticeable is here the insistence on limes litus. The reader perceives a certain pleonastic mode. Probably for this reason, some editors, including the most recent Teubner editor Gian Gioconte, have suggested deleting the last line. Moreover, as you can read, rectum litus does not seem to be regular usage, and Servius comments on the present passage like significat eum ita navigasse non linqueret litus, emphasizing the stalemate really. Book 6 ends with a pause in the action and the ships are anchored. And this Stimmung significantly influences the beginning of the subsequent Book 7. Tuco velitoribus nostris eneia nutrix. Death is the most evident sign of stalemate. Caieta offers the occasion to a brief ideological interference. Thus, Book 7 also begins with a break, after which Aeneas and his companions' journey starts smoothly. So smoothly that they can avoid the close shores of Circe's island. Proxima circae raduntur litora terrae. This atmosphere seems to involve also the subsequent scene, Aeneas' encounter, very famous encounter with Rome's river. And here's the passage. I cannot dwell on all the interesting aspects of this iconic ecotone. Notice the massive presence of colors and natural elements, What interests me here is again the in-betweenness of this going through, the possibility that only literature has to stall to protract the passage through an age and a border. On this regard, I'd like to briefly refer to the book by phenomenologist Edward Casey, who describes the importance of edges, limits, rims, borders, even though, as he writes, edges do much more than demarcate or delimit spatial spread or temporal extent, being a formative force of their own. I shall maintain that the role of edges is central to the drama of experience at every level: perceptual, practical, cognitive, aesthetic, emotional, intersubjective. Far from being a negligible aspect of ordinary experience, they are an extraordinary and quite constructive, though also at times destructive, basis of this experience. What makes being an age so paradoxical at once something definite as defining the perimeter of something and yet so subject to change as coming to nothing? One answer is that edges are transitional in their basic character and in our perception of them. Except for decorative edges, they do not invite lingering, neither visually nor by way of inhabitation. Who, other than a zealous ascetic, would want to live on the edge of a cliff or on top of a pole? Edges mark an abrupt turn from one surface to another, and from one part of something to another part, or from one phase of an event to another. No wonder our look does not remain long with them, but characteristically sails past them, finding its way elsewhere. Every age and every perception of an age is on the way to elsewhere, on the verge of going somewhere else, and this is so even though edges also serve to establish the extent or spread of a given thing or place or event, its current closure. Okay, I won't read the rest. I go now to the second part of my talk, wandering around, going nowhere, the muddy middle. But metamorphosis operates against all houses. The quotation from Emanuele Coccia, Metamorphosis, in the epigraph nicely connects metamorphosis and the lack of a home determined by a perpetual motion and nomadism. It shouldn't surprise then to encounter right at the middle of the foundational book of the metamorphic genre, Ovid's Metamorphosis, the powerful figure of Medea, who can be considered the heroine of the nomadic alternative. For her flight can be read both as detachment from human affairs and of the obsession with autochthony and origins. As has been noticed by various interpreters, the appearance and the consequent disappearance of Medea is both astonishing and troubling. For Ovid's Medea does not correspond to Euripides' tragic heroine, nor to Apollonius Rhodus' enamored young girl. Moreover, in the preceding literary tradition, she had not been a metamorphic figure, as observed by Gildenhad and Sissus in the transformation of Ovid's Medea. Ovidianists have sometimes asked the question as to what is at the center of the metamorphosis. The very middle of the Carmen Perpetuum, represented by Book 7 and 8, seems to elude an explanation of its central position. Adopting a metaphor from Latour, Bruno Latour, these books can be said to present the model within a poem the readers perceive as classically conceived. There is a certain interesting connection between the middle of the Aeneis, we just saw this stalemate, and this other very messy and muddy middle. Classicists often tend, in fact, to construct their own textual providence, i.e. teleological hermeneutics, where everything comes nicely together without contradiction or conflict. I propose to establish the figure of Medea at the significant center between the moments of Book 1, such as the impossible description of the chaos, the destruction of humanity through the flood, and their rebirth from the earth with Pyrrha and Deucalion, and Book 15, characterized by Pythagoras' appearance. But what interests me here is the fact that what is supposed to be the center of Ovid's grand construction is in fact represented by a highly centrifugal figure, one that defies definitions. Medea never stays, always goes, and no motivation is given. She's the center that undoes any center by marginalizing the very concept of center. As pointed out by Carol Newlands, this metamorphic Medea is not coherent, rounded character. Moreover, Medea is the heroine of the nomadic science as described by Deleuze and Guattari in Magic. Structurally, it is important to emphasize that Medea is given a significant space, half of a book, a privilege she shares, not coincidentally, with Pythagoras. The long episode consists of 5 sections, a description of the young Medea in love with Jason, accounts of the rejuvenations of Jason's father Aeson, as well as of the failed rejuvenation which resulted in the murder of King Peleus, her chariot ride to Corinth, and the final scene in Athens. The major characteristic of this tale is represented by magic, which has the simultaneous power of superseding and marginalizing both divine and human activity. More importantly, the Ovidian Medea is represented as an interstitial character because she lives in the gaps of her own tradition, gaps that are used to supply metamorphic fits and evocations. This powerful metaphor can be further explored. The interstitial nature of the heroine perfectly resounds with the central position of her appearance within the poem. I'm quoting without signaling, sorry, Gildenhart and Cissus. Her in-betweenness is, in fact, her hallmark. The opening lines of Book 7 are highly significant since they bear an important trace of the discourse of nature and earth, which in its materiality is regularly obscured and neglected in scholarly readings of this passage. Previous interpretations of this passage have typically pointed to a range of intra- and intertextual relationships. Gildenhart and Cissus see here a denial of the Argonauts' epic adventure as narrated in the first book of the Apollonius poem, and they also notice a tension in poetological terms. And I'm quoting, a central programmatic preoccupation of the metamorphosis signaled in the exordium is the aesthetic tension arising from the conflicting demands of a Carmen Perpetuum, referring to a large-scale epic composition, and a Carmen Deductum, referring to a smaller-scale poetry characterized by Alexandrian refinement. Barchesi comments on Perpetua sub nocte as a programmatic echo of the prologue's Carmen Perpetuum, and although he points out a significant detail, the Matterway, Limosi Facidus, a feature which had never been attributed to the specific river before, nonetheless he considers it suspicious. In its apparent lack of connection, he sees in it a transparent reference to Callimachian poetological agenda. A simple but revelatory detail indicates much more than what has been established by the acute eye of intertextual critics. The river Phasis is defined as limosus, muddy, opaque, while Jason is clarus, illustrious, but also, of course, bright and transparent, i.e. the opposite, limosus, a muddy natural element and a clear man. Edouard Glissant discusses in his Foundational Poetics of Relation the opposition between opacity and transparency in literary language. Literary textual practice, he writes, represents an opposition between two opacities. The irreducible opacity of the text, even when it is a matter of the most harmless sonnet, and the always evolving opacity of the author or a reader. This tension between transparency and opacity can generate a productive approach to Ovid's text, because opacity is not enclosure within an impenetrable autarky, but subsistence within an irreducible singularity. Again, Glissant. Seen from this perspective, the muddy Phasis leads the reader to knowledge of Medea not as a stereotypical figure of myth and previous texts, but as an irreducible singularity on her own. Glissant sees in the insistence of transparency a typical trait of Western culture and its inherent imperialistic drive. Opacity, therefore, has the task of unveiling that violence. And this is connected with the following passage. This opacity is an effect of the hermeneutic nomadic alternative I'm presenting to you. Moreover, in the exordium of Book 7, territoriality itself is emphasized. Environmental hermeneutics teaches us how to appreciate descriptions of places in their very materiality. The initial reference to the mudiness of the river passes beyond any intertextual reference and discourse on literary genres should be taken for what it is. The reader is entering the territory of this particular story, located at the significant center of the metamorphic universe. And this center is nothing but a muddy, in-between, opaque, unreadable, unresolved place. A place where something happens that has no consequences for the further narrative development. Medea appears and then disappears without leaving any traces. She's not transformed into anything. She just goes through her own carmina. È fuggitilla necem nebulis per carmina montis. Where this final nebulosity strangely resounds with the initial muddiness. The entire episode begins and ends with an impossibility to establish clarity, being clarity the quality of clarus iason, arma virumque cano. The reference to the mighty earth and its epistemic opacity opposed to human, or more specifically, a man's clear or right reason, claro sub iasone, who wants to determine and subjugate it, analogously to the Virginian arma virumque. After having killed King Pelias, Medea flies away. During her aerial journey, she produces another narrative, one which consistently lacks temporal structures. To be more precise, not only is there properly no narrative, if narration is understood as a sequence of logically connected scenes, but also no particular authorial agency. Medea is literally wandering around without going anywhere. She's not in charge and does not determine what she observes from her chariot while riding through the sky. Her function seems precisely to be the undoing of human history and consequently literature, not only in terms of a specific narrative strategy taken by Ovid himself. During her flight, Medea appears extraneous, not interested or concerned in the least with what she's seeing. But above all, it is motion itself that is thematized. The lack of narrative coherence and the difficulty of finding any apparent meaning within the episode suggest that Medea's flight deserves our attention on its own, and as such, perpetual movement, as suggested by Goccia, characterizes the life of and on our planet, a word that derives from Greek planoamai, meaning to wander. It is because of the planetary nature of Gaia and all of her children that everybody on Earth is subject to metamorphosis, quotations from Goccia. Among the various metamorphic episodes narrating during Medea's flight, one of the first is striking for the reference to the flood narrated in Book 1, and this is the passage. The short reference to the genesis of the human race after the apocalyptic flood has confounded critics. Not only does it not have any logical connection to Medea's own story, being presented merely as a gratuitous detail, but also, and more significantly, Carambus Eventus openly contradicts the initial narrative of Pyrrha and Deucalion in Book 1, where Ovid explicitly tells us that the couple are the only human beings who survived the flood sent by Jupiter in order to destroy humanity. This offering of two or more versions of a myth is a recurrent element in the Metamorphosis, but here this cannot be reduced to a purely narrative game. In this case, despite the lack of logical connection, it is easy to observe a similarity between Carambus and Medea. Both are saved by an aerial intervention so that they can fly safely away from the place where the life is at risk. Moreover, the contradiction with the official narrative established in Book 1 has the effect of arousing fundamental doubts about the veracity not only of Ovid's tale of anthropogenesis, which is directly evoked by the Cauliones, but more generally by destabilizing what within the universe of the poem are described as the origins of human history. And it also brackets this crucial cosmogonic event by rendering it only as insignificant detail offered to readers en passant and emphasizing their fundamental relativity and perhaps even irrelevance from the perspective of Medea the nomad, who observes without commenting. At closer glance, there is another interesting detail. This surprising new version of the deluge openly challenges not only Ovid's account, but also what Jupiter himself is said to have done. It is, however, not Medea herself who produces this new version. She simply and superficially observes it. There she reads, she's a superficial reader in our terms. Therefore, it is as if she were testifying to another truth, one which does not correspond to the one authorized by the poet in Book 1. But while Ovid's account is presented as authoritative, Medea's is a vision from above, emotionally detached and uninterested. Her aerial journey that emphasizes again superficiality, superficial reading, and thus not only the internal Ovidian narrative, but also human temporality, and represents pure movement in space, bereft of purpose. Medea's narrative has no teleology as such. Her constant movement is nomadic par excellence. This nomadic heroine is namely not interested in nor affected by what she is watching. Her gaze upon the described events are really from the outside, and she stays detached. And the text, in so doing, invites the reader to take on this distant perspective, that is rendered almost cinematographically from an in-motion vantage point. The meaning of those scenes is completely open to interpretation, at one condition, though, that every attempt of interpretation must be conscious of its intrinsic partiality and subjectivity. As argued by Bradotti, nomadic subjectivity addresses the need to destabilize and activate the center. Mainstream subject positions have to be challenged in relations to and interaction with the marginal subjects. In this case, Medea is both center and margin. Located at the center of the Ovidian epic, she triumphs in her marginality. She in fact represents a margin that defies the center and the narrative and ethic expectation that a center usually produces. Part 3 and last, the third bank of the river. I have an entire part of Lucian, which I deleted because a river is a strange place, the essence of which seems to escape our perception, mainly because we see it as a point from which we pass, which must be crossed and which we cannot stop. At the same time, the river represents the border, the edge, or the bank par excellence, not only because it cuts through and divides a territory, and because you have to cross it to reach a destination beyond it, but also because it itself consists of two banks that delimits it. As has been argued by Wyman Herendeen, what is a river? It is the water between its banks, or the banks which embrace that protean element. If the banks created by the farrowing water, is it not also the meadows, fields, and forests, which are no less the product of their movement? The river seems to perfectly embody the essence of a nomadic subject in Bradotti's term. In this last section of my talk, I would like to discuss together two texts written in different languages and in different historical contexts. A late antique poem written by the bishop Enodius from the 6th century, and one of the most read tales of Brazilian literature, A Terceira Margem do Rio, The Third Bank of the River, by João Guimarães Rosa, written in 1962. Both texts narrate a relationship with the river and its banks. The way I intend to approach this discussion is by staying in the middle myself of the river, i.e., I purposefully linger on the edge, the limit, the boundary of and in the river itself. Enodius' poem reveres the simple title Itinerarium that places it firmly within the ancient odopoetic genre, i.e., poetry describing a journey. In this short poem in hexameters, he focuses on the autumn flooding of the Po River, which the poet describes the overflow, the inundation of the surrounding lands and houses, and then the normalization, that is the retreat of the river's fury. The poet himself is forced to cross the river during this difficult period to fulfill a family obligation. What is particularly interesting, on the one hand, is the tension between the allegorical function of water as a source of poetic inspiration and the reality of the exaggerated flooding of the river itself, which seems to literally inundate inspiration. And on the other hand, the tension between the two banks. The experience described is, once again, that of the passage of the transit from one bank to the other. This transition is both textual and spatial. That is, it is placed in the span of the composition from its beginning to its end. That is to say, the poem is the site of the transit itself, insofar as it accommodates it within itself. The reader is forced to linger precisely on the crossing over, that is, on stopping exactly where it is not possible to stop, that is, there where crossing over is a necessity. I don't have time to close reading the whole poem, but I want to dwell only on one aspect that seems to me fundamental. The poem begins with an invocation to the Castalia fountain, representing the muses, so that they can provide the inspiration needed to sing about the matter of water. Inspiring talent, the source of speech and of the riches of language, may the waters of Castalia come where Thracian Orpheus, by diffusing its fluid, kindless shipwrecked herds. May this stream come and join the parched cracks of my mind, hiatus. I could not tell of the waters of the Po unless I drench my dry limbs in a generous stream from the waters of Hippocrene. Hippocrene, how do you say? Yeah, Hippocrene. Dry words barely drip out in a meager telling. Prompt me of spring water to tell of piles of waves. How well he tells of waters, he to whom the charming river murmurs. As can be seen from the highlighted words, the element of water is very much present in this first part. One detail among others that seems particularly significant to me is the duplicated invocation to the Fons Castalia and to Hippocrene, a duplication that somehow saturates the metaphor itself, makes it, in a sense, an overflow on its own waters. Another interesting term is hiatus, which concludes line 4, the chasm hiatus that indicates the dryness of the nodus on the inspiration, which nevertheless configures the poem especially because it indicates an element whose main characteristic is precisely that it cannot be surpassed. The hiatus remains as such, like a geographical absolute. It doesn't allow one to proceed, it blocks the passage, and thus indicates a stalemate of the path that is interrupted without having come to a conclusion. But what happens is very peculiar because the text insists on the duality of water as a metaphorical element, the source from which the poet receives inspiration, and the abundant waters of the poem itself, which the poet is about to describe during flood. It is thus as if the reader were witnessing the transition from metaphor, that is, from the concept characterizing literary discourse par excellence, to reality, that is, to the materiality of the river itself. And I'm sure that Tom can tell us something about this. When viewed in this way, everything that happened in the poem is nothing more than a transfer from one point to another of the text and the river. That is, the poem contains the real from one bank to the other, and at the same time transfigured passage, from the metaphor of the poetic word to the materiality of the bank. At the beginning, the Muses and Orpheus, representatives of classical pagan poetry, are invoked, and at the end, it is the poet himself who is safely transferred to the other side of the river, explicitly marked by the presence of Christ. This is the final line, et me festibis Christo pertuit oris. The poem ends with a word designating the destination of the poet's journey to the other bank, oris. dative plural of ora, bank of shore. Oris, genitive singular of os, mouse, and therefore song, with therefore a very different meaning, was found in the first verse, in the first line, fons oris, where the water element is nevertheless present in the nominative fons. This transition from song to earth, that is from one meaning of oris to another, represents to the transition from the abstraction expressed by fons oris, source of inspiration, to the water of the river in flood. And therefore, what takes place between the two banks of the river, i.e. what is described in the poem itself, represents a moment of suspension between the two conceptual banks, i.e. from the allegory, fons oris, to the physical reality, oris. The text can thus be read as an allegory of the very process of literary signification, but surprisingly in the opposite way that one would expect. That is, the transition is not manifested from the matter to literature, but following the reverse path. And Nodius starts from the poetic inspiration, fons oris, in order to end with orae, i.e. the materiality of the riverbank. In parallel occurs the transition from pagan tradition, Orpheus the Muses, to the message of Christ, the shore of salvation, real salvation, because Nodius precisely manages to land safely. The third bank of the river, A Terceira Margem do Rio, is the title of a famous short story by João Guimarães Rosa, included in the collection Tutamaya ou Terceiras Histórias. It is the strange story of a virtuous family man who suddenly decides to have a canoe built in order to live his life in the middle of the river. Unlike Nodius, he doesn't cross the river, but he literally remains in the middle of it. Jacques Rancière, who devoted a wonderful essay to this tale, observes the protagonist reappears regularly in the same place, as if the river itself were a fixed abode, escaping the fate of every river that is to flow into the sea. Rancière emphasizes how the man settles in the middle that is no longer the middle of anything. And as Guimarães Rosa writes, what wasn't there happened. Aquilo que não havia acontecia. Rancière's essays bearing the title Afissao à beira do nada, the fiction on the edge of nothing, is enlightening precisely because it not only identifies the central role of the age, but also because it connects this liminal situation to the narrative status of Guimarães Rosa's stories. But they are less stories than edges of story, quasi-stories that delimit but edges of all stories. In the space created between the two actual banks, Guimarães Rosa identifies a third bank, an absurdity because a river, by definition, can only have two banks. Furthermore, the introduction of the third margin suppresses the role of the other two normal banks and establishes the supremacy of the third. A pure middle, a middle which is not the middle of anything, but which is an autonomous and infinite universe. The French critic identifies the cipher of Guimarães Rosa's work in the relation between the ages. Guimarães Rosa stories tell us about this edge-to-edge relationship between what is delimited and what is limitless. This is what he puts into fiction, this place without margins, which is always there alongside ordinary life. My conclusions, so it is time to conclude my nomadic journey through very different texts and ages. Bredotti recalls that nomadism is not fluidity without borders, but rather an acute awareness of the non-fixity of borders and fixity of boundaries. It is the intense desire to go on trespassing, transgressing. She also emphasizes that the figuration of the nomad renders an image of the subject in terms of non-unitary and multi-layered vision as a dynamic and changing entity. By embracing Beredotti's critical thinking in this paper, I was adopting her nomadic subjectivity as a hermeneutic tool for investigating ancient literature. The purpose of my discussion is a first attempt at introducing a nomadic alternative where not only the adjective but also the noun matters. Before opening up the discussion, I would only emphasize that in this paper, I have initially indicated a kind of textual tension that I have detected elsewhere in a vast array of different works. The tension between a center and its margins, understood also as edges, boundaries, and limits. At the beginning, I discouraged my audience from finding a clear beginning and end in my discussion. But now, by way of concluding, and surprisingly for myself, I find a resonance between the initial Virgilian ab oris and the final late antique Ennodian oris in relationship with that marvelous third bank found by humanized Tosa. To sum up of the points I touched upon in order to design a nomadic hermeneutic alternative, the tension with canonicity, in particular intended as genealogy, exaltation of origins and intertextuality, relativization of the immediate historical context and authorial intention, outside perspective, disidentification as hermeneutic principle, superficiality, superficial reading, intention with deep reading, superficiality. Thank you so much.
I'm going to take over from Tristan as the adjudicator of moderator of questions, and in line with our usual practice of when we have a hybrid session, is we'll take a question from the floor and then a question from the Zoom community. Anyone who's on Zoom watching, if you'd like to type the letter Q into the chat, then I can establish an order of questions, but we'll begin in the room itself. Is there anyone here who has a question? Tom.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredible. Characteristically, all over the shop in a great way. But I wanted to, I guess, first of all, I just wanted to comment. Like, I found your description of working in 5 languages quite moving, actually, and I thought that was a very kind of honest account of what it is to be polyglot. I know you don't buy into that term, but like, I think the myth of classics is very much a myth of effortless, frictionless functioning in 1,000 different languages where you have equal mastery in all of them, right? And I think what you're saying is like, it's not that, you know, kind of be sort of having an ability in another language actually like sort of in a good way robs you of mastery in your native language as well. And I thought that really squared with, you know, with my experience as well, and is a much better way to frame it. So I had just a couple of questions. The one was on, the first one was on this sort of, you know, the amount of choice involved in a sort of nomadic existence, whether that be physical or intellectual. I think, you know, you've had this experience in academia that's been very international, and many others have that experience nowadays, but they don't choose it. They're forced to have it. The sort of conditions of academia nowadays are, you know, there's a kind of a precarity that often makes you move, even when you don't want to. And a lot of the younger scholars I talk to, and something I went through myself, is like, we long for stability, you know, we absolutely long for a permanent job, you know, we want to be there. So I wanted to ask you whether your sort of attraction to nomadism is actually predicated on a fundamental stability, and whether you actually always enjoyed that experience of nomadism, or whether it's something that came with a permanent job for you. And then the second thing is about rivers. And I found that Ennodius poem really, really interesting, right? And this, you know, this idea of the poet sort of always engaging with fluid in a very sort of hesitant way, like, you know, the spring, you're always just kind of sipping from the spring. But then Ennodius seems to sort of flirt with this, you know, the spring actually allows you access to this really sort of overwhelming flood. And so I wanted, you know, to know if you think he's sort of trying to move past that literary tradition of very sort of tentative engagement with water, and sort of try to dive right in the deep end and sort of be immersed in it. Anyway, those are the two things.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the first question, yeah, this is a very personal question, right? I don't know how to answer. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed or it was my project to live the way I actually live. I mean, it wasn't not an exaggeration. I don't stay longer than a week in one of those places. Like a triangle, and when I am abroad, I have even a quadrangle or a quintangle, and and it's not. I mean, I constantly travel between cultures, languages. In Germany, I live in Berlin. I go to Ghent, different languages, different settings. Then I go a lot to Italy to visit my mom. So I don't know. I mean, I realized on the one hand that this kind of experience did influence my life, but I was very happy to find that actually those thinkers who are rather sedentary thinkers like Blaise Guattari. Yeah, Bredotti is actually from Australia. She was born in Italy. She went to Australia, and then she's now. Yeah. But they don't practice this kind of work. Yeah. So I don't think it is really a matter of practicing a certain life, but it is rather an intellectual investment, right? Yeah. And like the way, like considering the current debates about classics, as you were perfectly telling us, like there is this sense of being anchored to tradition. This is our job, right? The tradition is very important to us, but as Bredotti was arguing, there is this cognitive jet lag. Actually, we are living in a completely different world where everybody's around really. But our setting, our mental intellectual setting is to repeat what disciplinary discourses propagate, so that are less interested in moving around, or rather, I mean, they start from a sedentary point of view. I guess this is what I want to, on my personal experience, which is really, and it's not false modesty, it's really, I mean, just an occasion to think about this. Yeah. Okay, and then the other hand, yeah, I mean, I see. He really, I mean, this paper has obviously, I didn't go there because this was not my main purpose, but of course there is an environmental issue. I mean, this is the reason why I'm so interested in this movement. And there is a doctoral student at Ghent University, Lina Williams, who is also from Australia, a lot of Australians right now. She works with me at this project, and she's a specialist of values. And we discussed this specific poem together. What interests me in this specific poem is the fact that the metaphor, the initial allegory or metaphor, is completely dissolved in the actual element of water. Okay, so that at the end he needs to get through the metaphor in order to get to the other bank of the river. Okay, and then this comparison with Guimarães Rosa was by no means like a virtuous, it's very instrumental in order to show how it works, a description of the river, and he talks about the third bank, which is a very interesting element. You stay actually in the middle of the river, and you don't move, which is impossible, right? This is literally impossible. And this is precisely what happens also in a Nonius text. So I needed to read the Guimarães Rosa in order to understand what is happening in a Nonius. And I think this is also in terms of reception, like this allelopoiesis, like the later text is influencing the way we read. It helps us in order to read back the ancient source. But this is another discourse.
Thanks.
Can I, even though I'm supposed to be moderating questions, I'm going to ask a question, right? There's no one in the queue in chat, so I'm going to just jump in. I mean, I found your talk extraordinarily fertile for ideas. Things just posted notes jumping out everywhere, becoming nomadic. For instance, I was thinking about Antigone. You were talking about Medea. I was thinking about Antigone, whose name means the opposite of birth, but also Antigonia could be, you know, the opposite of edges, right? Gonia. You could hear the idea of sort of displacement.
Right. This is very interesting because I'm going to talk in 2 weeks in Portugal on Antigone. So because I'm listening
because the ear might be Antigonia, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to polygonia.
Yeah.
Right. Multiplicity of edges.
Yeah. Right.
Opposed to edges, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so there was that I was thinking of, and I kept thinking about Hermes is the god who moves back and forth, but he never belongs in any one place. And of course, he is the eponym of hermeneutics, right? Of interpretation.
Right.
Moving back and forth.
Yeah.
So, but of course, the Indo-European etymology of theos in Greek comes from tithemi, poson, which means fixed place, right? That which is that is a point at which you make a communication, that you hold still, you chain down the statue to make sure the god doesn't go wandering off. This idea that gods go wandering. You need to pin them down, chain them to the floor with a statue so that you can kind of communicate with them. Altars are like that, they're fixed, you know, as opposed to these.
One temple.
Wandering divinity. So because in Homer, of course, they're moving.
They move around,
like arrows, you know, etc., etc. And always to do with movement, right? Apollo is far away, the far shooter. Athena is always near, next to your ear. You know, they're always having feasts in Ethiopia, but then they're in Olympus, and then so the divine. Really, I was really thinking about the divine all the time. And the last thing that I thought was really amazing, and I really liked, is that not only, of course, are the heroes like Aeneas and Odysseus, they're characteristically planetary, right? They're wanderers. Isn't it the first 2 lines of the Odyssey? Polytropos, who wandered far and wide after he'd sacked the city. But the poet is a wanderer. So, you know, Jenny Strauss-Clay, the Homeric scholar, she's argued that the catalogue of ships in Book 2 is not a catalogue of those who came to Troy, but is the itinerary of the poet.
Okay.
As he goes from town to town singing the song, right? And it's a little like a band when the band is on tour. You can the band sort of gets up on stage and says, "Hey, we love you, Sydney. You're our favourite city to play in. You know, Sydney's fantastic." And then next week it's, "Hey, Melbourne, you're fantastic." And everyone in the crowd goes, "Yeah, Melbourne." And in the catalogue of ships, the audience is waiting for the poet to get to the town area. And from this city came so and so with 50 ships, and that's us. We are represented. We are represented. But the poet himself is from nowhere.
That's very interesting. Is this a recent article?
I think it's not an article. It's a project that she has about the catalogue of ships. And when she puts all of the locations on a map, it spirals out from Boeotia all the way out through the Cyclades, all the way to Rhodes. And so it encompasses this kind of poetic itinerary, which, while on the one hand the story is about this camp on the shores of Troy, fixed,
but at the same time,
but the poet himself is wandering. And so that's the text being nomadic. Narrative itself nomadic, tradition's nomadic, because one song is always different from the next. Writing, on the other hand, comes along and wants to fix things.
But and this is the point exactly. So we have anomalies in terms of content. I totally agree, but don't we need to adopt this perspective in order to also make sense of this anomalism?
I think you've convinced me that the nomadic alternative is a genuine alternative and a necessary alternative.
Thank you.
That's right. We have a question from Zoom. Andre. I hope the volume has been up.
Yes, more or less. Actually, your own question I haven't been able to follow very precisely, but on the whole, it's okay. So I would like to voice some skepticism. So if I will caricature, of course. But it seems to me that your engagement for nomadism leads you to have an interest for certain texts, for certain topics, for certain figures, Medea, Metamorphosis, River, whatever you can bring under this nomad concept. So my first question is, how do you get from here, from the relationship between nomadism and a certain range of topics or texts, which can be new texts or not very well-known texts? How do you make the step from this to general hermeneutics? So in other terms, what is the status of the text that you leave aside? In relationship to your nomadic stance. So that would be one manner of raising the question. The second thing, which is, I think, harsher, is when I hear alternative hermeneutics, alternative to what, actually? Isn't that mythical dualism or metaphysical dualism? The whole story on the other side of nomadism is extremely complex. The story of hermeneutics is extremely complex. It is a field of discussion, opposition. I can name you one kind of discussion which interests me especially, but it's not the other one, the only one. For example, Gadamer's hermeneutic on the one hand, and Zondi's hermeneutics on the other hand, which have nothing to do with one another. And for that matter, one is intentional, if you want, although there would be many things to add about it, and the other one is non-intentional and has nothing to do with Deleuze and Guattari on the other hand. So the question is really this disjunction between one kind of hermeneutic and another kind of hermeneutic. Is it functional and really helpful? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Professor Lux.
I am not Professor Lux anymore.
Well, I mean, we never met each other, so I know you. Yeah, when I studied in France. No, I absolutely share also your, of course, point of view. Let me specify about the first question is really about the corpus, right? Of course, I can present only samples. But I tried to go out of my comfort zone, which is late antiquity, and I discussed the two foundational texts of Latin literature, DNAs and the Metamorphosis. I made the effort of, going to show with Arma virumque canotro ieque primus aboris. That was the first example where I couldn't find, being not a Virgilianist myself, any interesting discussion about this aboris, right, which concludes the first line. So of course, I mean, what can I tell you? Try me. I mean, give me a text and we can discuss, but I cannot discuss the entirety of. I don't want to even, not that I don't have it, but of course it's not my intention to create a stable hermeneutic instrument. By no means it is against my alternative. As I said, not only nomadic, but alternative. Alternative means implies that there is it is a work in progress always. So it is truly and modestly an alternative. As for so I don't know about the corpus. Of course, we can discuss single texts, right? I cannot discuss about the entirety of Latin or Greek literature. This is just impossible. And then, but it is the way we look at that, right? I mean, as a Latinist, as you know, I mean, Latin studies are Latin hermeneutics, so to say, is nowadays very much centered on intertextuality. This is the true obsession of Latinists. They read a text, 90% of the cases looking for intertextual relationships. And this is something I resist, and this is precisely my target, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't appreciate, in my opinion, is this intertextual game interesting, but self-complementing. I don't think that there is any intellectual hermeneutic force there. This might be my opinion, but this is the way I consider it.
I am very interested in this. So I am also, in some sense, against. I don't know what it means to be against, but I mean, I'm not satisfied, or I'm not happy with intertextual approaches. But what would be interesting for me is what is the you said it's my opinion, but certainly your opinion is founded on some kind of argument or view about some kind of weakness of this approach, the reason why.
Yeah, I can tell you.
Approach, and I would be interesting to hear about
I can tell you immediately. So the first thing is that intertextuality and the search for intertextual references forces the interpreter to consider authorial intentions. Okay, so we automatically neglect what is in the text and that is not produced immediately by authorial intention. First of all, so making authorial intention central, then you have intertextuality, because the author wanted to allude to Callimachus, to Euripides, to Homer, and so on. First of all. Secondly, paradoxically, all what is new, all what is not intertextual is systematically neglected because it doesn't fit the intertextual game. Oh, no, I cannot find this. This Maddi passus, so I was talking about the river, the Limosus, okay, river. This is not, okay, no, whatever. I mean, this is also an intertextual against Callimachus, against the clarity of Callimachus. Whatever, everything must have a correspondent within previous. If they don't find a correspondence, it's not worth of being commented upon, okay? Or it is dismissed as something. And thirdly, it really reduces. If you were a writer, André, if I may, if you were a writer writing a novel, would you like to be addressed only that your work is only discussed on the basis of what happened before you? I mean, I wouldn't resist that as an author. Avent sua fata libelli, whatever, I wrote this text, it can be associated with other texts, I don't care, okay? It's so for these three reasons, I think intertextuality, in the sense not of the original sense given by Giulia Cristeva to intertextuality, but the way it has been practiced within classical studies, and in particular, I believe, in Latin literature studies. Those three problems are, to me, fundamental to disregard intertextuality. My students are traumatized because I always repeat that. Okay. And then I would like to return to your second question. Of course, I am an admirer, and I consider myself also in the tradition of Peter Zondi. I'm coming from Berlin. The Freie Universität was the home of Peter Zondi. There is a lot of Peter Zondi there, so I perfectly understand. But this is not something opposite. I wrote about Peter Zondi on other occasions. And but this is not something that, in my opinion, we can talk about that is going against something like Peter Zondi would possibly consider. I don't think that there is a gap. I do know that the hermeneutic tradition, I'm not criticizing, I'm not that arrogant, although I might seem it to you. It's not the fact that I'm criticizing harshly like to dismiss the entire Western hermeneutic tradition. What I'm doing here is really modestly to find another way to approach those texts that is, in my way, liberating and not how do you say, pressed by the authority of the tradition. This is something, because nomads are not. Okay, so on the example of a nomadic superficial reader, I like this way, which is delicate, which is poetic, going through the world, observing things like my nomadic Medea, and wandering around and observing a certain harmony, but also disruption, a moment of nonsense. And we must accept, as readers, moments of nonsense that any text creates, not only the clear sub claro iasone, the clear statement, the clear structure, and so on. This is my...
Okay, thank you. It opens a large bulk of questions that we are not going to talk about today, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Tristan, you have a question?
Thank you, Marco. I really enjoyed your talk. I especially liked you bringing in Rancière because I was thinking about Rancière as you were speaking. And I want to ask you a question in the spirit of Rancière, pushing you in a Rancièrean direction. Because it seems to me that like the opening gambit that your paper makes is positing the kind of fixity of classics or of culture. And that came especially clearly through your abstract for the talk. And I think it works really well as a starting point, but then I wonder whether by the end, and after this lovely exploration of nomadism and the awareness of how much nomadism kind of is at work in classical culture, classical literature, whether we actually have to then revise that starting point and see the starting point that is the fixity of classics as not something that we can take for granted, but rather that there's a willfulness in establishing the fixity of classics or of culture from a position of constant movement and nomadism, and whether that then changes at all the kind of intervention you're making. Does that make sense? So rather than say culture is fixed or classics is fixed, but then we can intervene by seeing nomadism and experiencing, or rather being attuned to the experience of nomadism in scholarly life, and then reorient ourselves to the fixity of classics, which is otherwise unchallenged or not revised. That's one approach. What I'm wondering, and what I think is a kind of Rancièrean move, and I won't elaborate on why because that would take too long, that the Rancièrean move is actually to then say that starting point, the fixity of classics, is actually not there in the first place.
Yeah, it's a creation.
That is something that's created from the starting point, the actual starting point, which is the constant flux nomadism movement.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether...
Okay, this is a tricky question.
Yeah.
Because of course, it reminds us that the origins are not... So, that in this debate about classical studies, right? Called decolonizing wrongly because it's not only about decolonizing, it's about remaking the discipline, giving another face to our discipline. I think that very often, especially in Europe, to be honest, there is a huge misunderstanding. People in Europe think that you guys, you want to cancel. They are obsessed with this. They want to cancel Greek and Latin culture, which is not the case. It is really about the tradition of classical studies, of klassische Philologie. It all started in Germany in a certain period, in a certain context. Okay? And this is the problem. Okay, we must work on that, not on the status. So this question of yours, of course, there is this. This is an accompanying tension, theoretical tension in my talk. That there is this like going there at the origins. Although I resist origin, the discourse of origins, creating this mythology of origins stability. No, just try to work on that. So I do see your point. Of course, it is a very general issue, and I know that I'm bringing up also very general issue. So I deserve to be challenged on this kind of discussion. I cannot answer really your question. I find it very interesting, and I'm grateful. And yeah, of course. I mean, we can, but I don't think if can I I mean, that this observation would possibly change so much. I mean, this is something that must be, in a way, declared as an intention in the previous part, let's say, of this paper, of this project. That there is also this possibility, but in any case, that wouldn't change the impact of the texts, right?
No, it's just a finessing, and it's just a clarification.
A clarification of the intent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some respects, it's also working with the distinction between the Darstellung and the Vorstellung, the presentation and the argument or the rational account. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
But no, I love it. It doesn't challenge what you're saying, but it was more of a clarification of what exactly is being posited in the end. Is it that classics is fixed, but we ought to see nomadism, or is it that classics appears to be fixed, but that comes from a position of nomadism, which you can only appreciate once you've worked through the issue of nomadism. So you can't start at nomadism. You kind of have to start with the purported fixity, but then by the end, what are we actually believing? Is it that there is fixity in the beginning, or that there's nomadism and that fixity is a kind of willed projection or a willed maneuver or positing?
Especially since the presumed fixity of that seems to come from Altertumswissenschaft, right, in the 19th century, is in itself a reaction to the French Enlightenment, right? Which is the Aufklärung is a kind of nomadic alternative to the Enlightenment itself, isn't it? In some sense, right? Where there's a lot of wandering built into that as well, like the wandering of
right. Yeah. Well, there are so many different elements in that case, but I do agree that that moment is of course problematic, and it should be really a discussion about that foundational moment, the classische philology in that period in Germany. This is the moment where everything, let's say that the way we work is still, although there is this discussion going on. And but I don't want, again, really, it's not because I want to repeat this matter. I don't want to introduce, I'm not playing the game of introducing, okay, let's dismiss this and let's do that. It's not that.
No.
It's inviting to have this other possibility, which is always and must be, in my view, a possibility. It's my individual project. I mean, I'm not, I don't have the ambition of, compelling people to follow this alternative. It is my suggestion, and it is an alternative. Firstly, an alternative, and then it's nomadic. I wish we would have more alternatives. And I don't feel like in the very practice of interpreting Latin text, I'm talking really about my Latin literature sector, which is more, it works more in this way than Greek literature for several reasons, I think. Because, in Greek literature, you have more philosophy, more other drama is very, so you have other issues. Latin literature is more literature, and hence you have all that, how do you say, instrumentary, like that is fixed in a way.
Well, we might leave it there at that point. We're 4 minutes over time, but thanks to everybody in Zoom and around the world for joining us. Good to see you, Andre. I hope everybody's well, all our friends in the network. And it remains for me just to thank again, Marco, for such an extraordinary, provocative and interesting paper. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.